Hi. If your name's not on the list, if you're a new addition, if you want to just write your name, there's a sign-in sheet right there.
Okay. We're recording.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. I really appreciate you all deciding or agreeing to come to this early lecture. I think it's actually going to be a really nice opportunity for me to get to know each one of you a little bit better, so that's really exciting. Before we get started, I wanted to just mention and or remind our first field trip is actually going to be September 9th. And we're going to be going to Hopscotch Design Festival. So Hopscotch Music Festival is a big music festival that happens all over downtown. And the past couple of years, they started having a design component to it. And we're going to be attending one particular panel discussion. So if you haven't already signed up for a field trip and you want to go to Hopscotch, I think this is going to be a really great experience. Dory Tunstall, in particular, I'm really excited to see. She is a self-described design anthropologist. So you're going to hear me in this first module talk about anthropology, talk about design anthropology, talk about how designers have sort of used anthropological research methods in trying to understand problems better. So this is a panel we're going to, and then there's some other stuff that's happening afterwards that I think you can probably hang around and do if you want to. This one is one of those ones that is happening off campus, so we have transportation. We'll all go down there. So if you haven't signed up for a field trip, I just want to give that one a plug, because I think it's going to be a really, really exciting one. And I think it's also one of the ones I had to negotiate for a reduced rate for, so I'm like, I want a lot of people to go to it, because it was a lot of work to do that. So anyway, I just want to mention that and plug that. So today we're going to talk about, now I'm looking at this because it's a PowerPoint and my text is a little, my font is a little messed up, but hopefully it won't affect the content. So today we're going to go back and talk more about what is design thinking. So one of the most important things to know about design thinking is it's human-centered. That might seem obvious, but actually for a long time, designers didn't necessarily put humans and their needs and their wants and their uses at the center of their design problems or their design process. And it's a way of thinking about the world and how it might be improved. Designers and design thinking is about trying to improve things, make things better. So it's this way of thinking that I really like to think of, there's a little dotted line right here, as this real intersection between creative thinking and critical thinking. And the aim of it is to provoke insight. Designers want to have insight into some problem because it's that insight that's going to help them make it better. If we think of creative thinking as this real generative process, right, that also has these strokes of insight, but is very sort of broad, very creative. Sometimes we like to think of inspiration, creative thinking as being inspirational. And if we think of critical thinking as problem solving, going deep into something and kind of breaking it apart to understand it better, design thinking as a process connects these two things, really. So you're constantly going back and forth between those two ways of thinking. It has this distinct process, and we went over this in the last lecture, of empathizing, defining the problem, ideating, prototyping, and testing. And within each one of those, there's really specific goals that we're trying to get to in each one of these. So in the empathy phase, we're trying to learn about our audience. We're trying to learn about the users who might be using or implementing or buying the products and services that we're designing. And some of the tools and methods that we use in this, you're going to hear me talk about in more depth, but ethnography and ethnology, these are methods that have been borrowed from and adapted from anthropology. So designers use both social sciences and humanities-based research methods as well as science and adapt those to use sort of out in the real world. Not that social scientists and scientists aren't also doing stuff out in the real world. In the problem definition phase, so we can't always assume that we know what the problem is. So this first phase is really trying to identify, define, and redefine what it is that we're really doing, what the problem is, what the wicked problem is, and I'll talk about that in a second. Some of the tools we might use in the definition phase: writing, sketching, mapping, notating. So all of these phases are about this translation. So there's different methods that we use in trying to translate and connect one phase to the other. Ideation, this is probably the thing we think about most when we think about design and design thinking, is generating solutions. But it's really critical that we have that these two phases are really thorough for us to get to this phase, or else you'll find out the ideation phase is actually really, really difficult if you don't fully understand what it is that you're doing. Prototyping is a way to sort of test the sketches, right? So you're translating again from maybe something that's really loose into something that's much more functional. It doesn't have to be a final product, right? It can really be used as an iterative process, and we'll talk about that more really throughout the course of the semester. And then testing. And I talked in the last lecture that really we're highly focused in this class on these first three phases, and we get a little bit into prototyping and sort of speculating on prototyping. We don't get quite so much into the testing. So a lot of times I think we as designers, or we in using the design process, that this is the phases that you go to, that you start with a lot of things and you're constantly paring down until you get to the perfect solution. You've solved the problem, right? So you have one idea, it's the best idea, it solves all the constraints, it solves the problem, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I argue that that's not really what the process is, and that's not what the process should be. This is a little hard to see, but really throughout the entire process, you're generating and you're refining, you're generating and you're refining, and there's going to be a lot of ideas that maybe don't make it to the final iteration for this particular project, but they're still really valid, important, critical ideas that might actually help you in a future project. And what this is really this balancing of all of the constraints, balancing of what the project, the constraints might be time, the constraints when you get out into the real world, or even now as students, might be budget. The constraints might be what a client needs versus what you see a community group or a user group needing. A lot of times those are at odds with one another, surprisingly. And so this is this sort of constant balancing act between all of those things. Victor Papanak has said, he wrote a book called Design for the Real World, and he's a pioneer in sort of design, and he wouldn't call it design thinking, but he said design is basic to all human activities. So in this class, we're talking about design as a discipline, and we're talking about design as a profession and a practice, but really all people design, right? When you're kind of rearranging your dorm room, you're engaging in the design process because you're trying to coordinate things or put things in a way that functions really well for you. People will talk about design with the big D, which is kind of the discipline of design, and design with a little d, which is the activity of design. We talk about both in this class. Design thinking, when you become conscious of how you're thinking, you're moving into that big D professional design realm because you're doing it really intentionally and you're reflecting on the process that you're going through. So patterning of any act towards a desired goal, right? So you're trying to take an existing condition and turn it into a preferred condition. So it has distinct characteristics as a part of that process. And these are the characteristics. You're going to hear this a lot in this class. You're going to hear this a lot in your studio if you're in studio. You're going to hear this a lot in your design studies classes if you're in design studies. You're going to hear it a lot really all over, particularly in the College of Design, but all over. And sometimes people aren't going to use these specific terms, but you're going to see that these show up again and again. So framing and responding to complex or wicked problems. So how do you understand the problem? That's a huge part of, that's a characteristic of design thinking. Empathy. We're going to talk about these first two a little bit more in this lecture, sort of getting into the resolving competing demands. So resolving competing demands, constraints. Sometimes those demands are in sync with one another. Sometimes those demands are at odds with one another. So we have to sort of think through all of that and balance those things like what I was just talking about. Design thinking is also characterized by this thing called abductive reasoning, which is kind of like a hunch. So those of you who really, in any class, you get a prompt for a project, right? Or you get a prompt for a paper or something like that. If you've done your homework and in design, a lot of that is pre-existing knowledge, the hunches, but you have an immediate idea about what you want to do, right? So you get a project that's about designing a playground. You've got an immediate sort of reaction to what it is that you might do in order to design a better playground. Part of what design thinking is about is testing those hunches. So going through a process where you're not just sort of going forward on that assumption, but you're testing it, you're doing research that validates or invalidates whatever that assumption might be. And so that's the iterative problem solving that you go through in order to test those hunches. So, so abductive reasoning, iterative problem solving, and then I think that this is not something that has been as central to the design thinking process, but I think it's really, really important, is this projection, speculation, elasticity of mind, so being very flexible to what it is that you see in front of you, not being so fixated on the answer that when some other idea presents itself to you, you can't recognize it. So this, I think, elasticity of mind is really important. There was at MoMA a couple of years ago, there was an exhibition. Paolo Antonelli is the design curator at MoMA in New York. And there was this great exhibition called Design in the Elastic Mind, which was all of these speculative projects. The prompt, the sort of premise of it was that designers can take these sort of scenarios, right, that might not be true, that might be totally fictional, but because designers are so embedded in sort of functionality and in the real world, they can start to really think about how these future scenarios can play out. So it's this really important opportunity for us to think about issues of environmentalism, and not just think about it in an abstract way, but think about it in a really, really concrete way. So some of the designers were doing projects where they were speculating on there's overpopulation in the world, on the Earth. The Earth actually can't sustain the population. There's just not the potential to make enough food, to grow enough food in the world. What do we do? So that's a prompt that then designers start to think about, what do you do in such an extreme situation? Could you design machines or tools that would take non-edible food and actually turn them into something that's edible, right? And we can challenge even the value of that, because do we want to create things that allow the world to sustain a population that naturally it can't even really sustain, right? So it kind of brings up all of these interesting questions. And then the last thing is modeling or prototyping. So not just doing something that is completely abstract, although I think there's interest and value in doing that too, but taking it into a real world context, something that you can hold or feel or experience and kind of play out. So has anybody heard the term wicked problems before? Have you heard that term before? Anybody? Or messy problems? Do you have any ideas about what that might mean? Like, what might a wicked or a messy problem be? So it's not clean. It's the opposite of clean. So what might that mean for a problem? Any ideas? So wicked problems or messy problems are problems that do not have a clear solution. I mean, at its very base. Like, there's no clear solution to a wicked problem. So that means there's no single formulation of the problem. So even, I mean, we could talk about something like hunger, world hunger, lack of housing. That is a wicked problem. But there's no one way to look at that wicked problem. There's a lot of factors that are contributing to it. And so how you define that wicked problem is and the questions that you ask about it is ultimately how you're going to solve it. I just used two examples of really, really big wicked problems, right? World hunger, but they don't all have to be big. So designing a better to-go coffee cup might actually be a wicked problem. There's no single way. There's no single question that you would ask about that, right? People are going to have different uses or needs for that. So they have no stopping rule. So what that means is that you don't actually solve a wicked problem. Even as designers, you're intervening in it, and you're trying to sort of take an existing condition and make it better. But it's not like you've solved it once it's done. You know, there's going to be other problems that are going to occur as a result of that. They might be small. So as designers or design thinkers or people who are trying to intervene, make things better, it's really just acknowledging and making the best decisions possible, knowing that it's not clean. It's not going to be clean afterwards. Solutions to wicked problems are not right or wrong, so they're better and worse. I think you could say that the solution has solved more things than maybe problems that it's created. But last summer I was in California, and the students there were doing they were looking at this existing bus terminal that really, in San Diego, I mean, it makes sense, but I didn't know this. There's a huge homeless population there. And so they were looking at this bus terminal and sort of looking at issues of, like, safety. It had this real historic background to it, but nobody really knew about that. And so some of the students, the way that they were looking at it, they were saying, well, there's really no sitting room, so maybe we'll just create these benches all around. Well, if you look into that and you're looking at safety and issues of safety too, if there's a really large homeless population, right, and you're putting all these benches around, then that's probably going to attract more people. So then you really have to think about, well, is the problem that I'm solving, is that actually creating bigger issues for this area, or what? So again, it's all about sort of balancing those things. And I've already kind of said this, but there's no real, well, it's a little different. There's no real universal test to the problem. So it's not, we do go through a testing process in design. We try to test the outcomes. We try to see, is that effective? But we do that in real discrete ways, because there's no real way to, or universal test to, okay, have I solved this problem, of how people view this bus terminal, for instance. So we can look at certain things like, okay, is traffic higher? Are people hanging out more? Are they using it and going out into the community? Whatever our sort of goal was, we can look at more discrete things. So I don't know how many of you guys are from Raleigh or have sort of explored yet, but do you know what this is? Is this familiar to you? What is it? Yeah, the new Cameron Village, like apartments, right? So what wicked problem does this solve? Housing. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, totally, right? So they build apartments because people need housing. There's a wicked problem. There's not enough housing, or there's not enough housing in the right places, or whatever. What other wicked problems might something like this solve? Retail space. Yeah, so it's mixed use. So you can kind of get everything in one place, right? So you might not have to, you don't have to travel as far in theory. Also for NC State students, it's a great alternative to on-campus housing or whatever, although I hear they're very expensive, so I don't know how many students are actually living in them. What problems might something like this provoke? What might be some negative outcomes of something like this? Yeah, Nick.
Generate more heat from the surface of the roof?
Yeah, right. So, yeah, so just environmental heating. It like starts,
Right.
It gives off more heat. Yes, excellent. So that's definitely one sort of outcome. What else? What other problems might something like this provoke? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it might actually price out other people, which is something that's absolutely happened. People who are in the surrounding area, some of who have been there for years and years and years. Now taxes are getting higher. They can't live there anymore, or they can't. They're not. What else? Anything else? I mean, there's a lot of other things like traffic. So traffic becomes something. Now you've got all these people in this dense little area. Traffic right around it. Parking becomes an issue. Even like waste and litter, just when you've got more and more people that are in a concentrated area. And one of the things that was that people in the surrounding area sort of noticed once it got built is it replaced really low buildings. And when they built these much taller buildings, there was sort of this tunnel effect, which was disorienting. So people didn't know where they were for a while. I mean, they did. It wasn't like they were wandering around not knowing where they were. But it really changed the landscape, and it changed the way people understood that intersection. When the construction was going on, there was definitely a lot more traffic. Parking, there is parking underneath. It's very small, so it actually doesn't really house. I mean, we can sort of say those are critical problems with the design, but any project is going to have those issues with it. Any design intervention is going to have those issues with it. So what we try to do, in solving these wicked problems is empathize. We try to anticipate. We try to really understand who's going to be using our products and services, who's going to be living in our buildings, who is surrounding the building, if we use that as an example. So empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. So we already mentioned design thinking is user-centered. That means we need to understand our users, and there's a lot of different ways we can do that. And really this first assignment, one of the aims of that is to get you to empathize with the people who are in the experience or the environment that you're going to be observing. It might help us understand users' feelings toward a product or a service or an experience if we're empathizing with them, if we're putting ourselves in their shoes. And ultimately helping us create more, I should really change all of these products. Where it says product, it should say experience or product or experience or something like that. Because in design, we know that we're moving outside of just designing products. So Whole Foods, right? What do you think of when you look at this picture, or what do you think of when you go into a Whole Foods? How do you think that Whole Foods has maybe done research to empathize with their customer base? Any ideas? Yeah, Nick.
The arrangement is kind of simplified to like colors, and also like they're all just packed into one section.
Yeah, very neat, very clean, right? I mean, I don't know if you're like me, but when I go into Whole Foods, all of a sudden I'm like the healthier, richer version of myself, So I buy things that I wouldn't normally buy in a regular grocery store. I mean, everything in there, there's an assumption that it's all healthy. So I'm not going to even bother looking at the side of the package to see what's in it, because they've done such a great job of sort of researching their user base that they know how to kind of inspire. So Whole Foods, in their research and in their empathy, they have not just sort of given the people what they want, or they're not speaking necessarily to only a group of people who are already Whole Foods people. They've done research, and they've sort of looked into it. So they're speaking to a group of people who are aspiring to be something else, right? And it's only through the research and the understanding of a wider range of users that they've been able to sort of accomplish this and do so really effectively. It's always like, a treat for me anyway, like to go to Whole Foods, right? So I go to my regular grocery store for my like kind of boring shopping, and I go to Whole Foods for my inspired shopping, I guess. So, but it's because they've sort of understood not just one user, but a range of users, and they've empathized with a range of users that they've really been able, over the past 10 or 15 years, to be the premier natural food store and to take it out of the hippie granola, whatever. Like when natural food stores first came out, that was absolutely like, that was sort of the customer, and Whole Foods has done an excellent job of sort of taking it out of that realm. So empathy is really, really important. It's at the heart of design. We are not, as designers or design thinkers, you're not designing for yourself. You're not solving a problem. You might be part of that user base, and of course you're effective when you can personally relate to something. But we are always designing for others. So without the understanding of what others see, feel, and experience, design is really sort of a pointless task. Sorry, some of these got really small, too, in the translation. So the research strategies in design, and again, this first assignment that you guys are going to be doing, is really an opportunity, and I'll talk about this in a second, to empathize. So to practice some of these research strategies, to try to see and uncover things that really just doing sort of a simple survey would not uncover. So you have to spend time with your users. You have to spend time on the research problem, or on the research problem, or at the beginning of the process, to really understand what it is that you're even doing in the first place. We can all come up with really superficial answers. We can all make something that's beautiful, but is it functional? Does it fill a gap? Is it inspired or inspiring? Those are all questions that I want us to ask. So the research methods have increasingly been focused on what are some ways that we as designers and design thinkers can start to sort of feel and understand. IDEO has come out, and you're going to hear, I already mentioned this, we talk about them throughout because they really have been pioneers in making design thinking accessible. So they've come out with these method cards. They're over in the design library. I've posted some of them on Moodle, the ones that are particularly relevant to this first assignment. There are a lot of different ways that you can learn. They have these 4 categories: look, learn, try, and something else. I can't remember what the last one is. But wait, maybe I can see right here. Learn, look, ask, and try. So anyway, so take a look at those. They're great. There's a lot of great methods, and they're fun. They're fun methods. So we're going to talk about a couple. So one of the things you can do, and as hopefully all of you have looked over assignment 1 already, so be thinking about that as you're going through these. These are all research methods that you can use in assignment 1. So some of them will be easier than others, but a day in the life. So try to observe firsthand how somebody goes through the process. Yes, did you have a question? Oh, okay. How somebody goes through their day, how users and audiences, what they do, right? So that can be very broad. You can be looking at, how do they travel, or what sort of public or private transportation systems are you using, or you can just follow them and sort of see everyday life and what it is that they're doing. It depends on what the sort of goal of your research is. So MIT, and we're going to come back to this a little bit, but quite literally, students at MIT had designed this empathy suit, right? So this is the empathy suit. And what the empathy suit does is allow researchers to experience a day as an elderly person. So they've done stuff like constrained the movement of their neck, constrain their peripheral vision, so the peripheral vision isn't as good, constrain the movements of their arms, and then so they're in Cambridge and Boston, and then going around Boston, getting on the T, going shopping. Having this suit on really allows them to experience it in a very different way and start to see, well, where are their problems? Maybe bending down, the placement of this T-stop map is harder for an older person because it's harder to bend down and they can't stand up straight or whatever. Where you're putting juice in the aisle of a grocery store, right? So this is very broad in terms of what they're looking at. But being able to really constrain your physical experience in a way to see what it's like for a particular user group to go through the day. Or as an architect, designing a kitchen and then saying, okay, well, I've designed this for a certain body size, but what if that body size is different? How is the placement of, where I've put the dishwasher? How does that change if now all of a sudden I've got this big belly because I'm pregnant, or whatever? And sometimes you can abstractly speculate on that, but, in these particular instances, they're literally augmenting their body so that they can really feel it firsthand. Another method is a fly on the wall. So this is the kind of stuff a lot of you are probably going to be doing in this first assignment, a fly on the wall. You're not going to intrude in everyday life. You're going to be sort of sitting back and watching. Watch and see how users interact with a product, with a space, with an object without interfering. And the thing that's really important about not interfering is that you see naturally what it is that they do. So you're not modifying their behavior. You can see, in a coffee shop, for instance, like, do they make a beeline for the cash register, or do people stop and say hi to a bunch of people because everybody in the coffee shop knows each other or whatever, But you can start to see those patterns in your fly on the wall observations. So this is actually an artist and a photographer in Moscow who recorded this park bench and the uses of the park bench, actually over 4 years, I think. Yeah, 4 years. And you can see all of the different ways that people, you might think of park bench so mundane. That's like, why would you record that? But there's all these really interesting, great ways that people use the park bench. So you can start to see, is one group of people using it for sort of a social thing? are multiple groups of people using it where they're not engaging or where they are engaged. Obviously, kids using it and creating a little mini micro group, and we can read in a lot to that, or sleeping on it, falling off of it, maybe had a little too much to drink. So this is all insight into how people use this particular location, how people use this object in this location. And he's not necessarily trying to intervene in it. This is more of an anthropological, artistic study. But it's valid. It's a valid way for us as designers and design thinkers to consider how we might engage or intervene. One of my students in a class last year was looking at Avent West. And as a very different type of fly-on-the-wall observations, she started to look at listservs and what was going on in the neighborhood and the topics that they were talking about, what time of year it got more, or actually this is entire years. So over the years, how it got more or less sort of verbose in the chat room activity. So these color coding are all the different topics. And then she looked at also where there was data on where the posts and stuff were coming from. So she could start to see the different types of people that were participating. Were they spread out or were they concentrated? They're actually quite spread out around the neighborhood. And so this is another type of digital fly-on-the-wall observation. She wasn't intervening in anything. She was watching and looking at how this neighborhood and residents in this neighborhood sort of interacted with one another. Another interesting one is called a personal inventory. So it documents things that people identify as important to them. And so in this one, you're sort of engaging people. You're asking them if you can document what it is that you could probably sort of do it as a fly on the wall, but in the personal inventory, you're sort of asking people what it is that's important to them, or possibly what it is that they're just carrying around in their knapsack. So again, I use a lot of artist references because they just do such interesting work. And so another artist, Francois Robert, did this project on contents. And so he asked people to share with him. He just sort of grabbed them, or not grabbed them, but approached them on the street and asked if they would participate in his project and just show him what was in their bags. And then he laid them out sort of all in this really archaeological, sort of archival way. But you can see in doing that what it is. These are the things that people are carrying around with them all the time, what's important to them, or maybe what's not important, but they just haven't bothered to get rid of, and why. So it becomes this really interesting sort of comparative study around what it is that people carry around with them on a daily basis. And so again, to keep with the, like the coffee shop metaphor, looking at what people have on the table with them, doing a sort of an archival account of something like that. Actually engaging people in the space is sort of interesting. What are you bringing here? What are you doing? And taking pictures of that. Most of you probably won't do anything like that for this first assignment. I mean, it really is going to depend on what it is that you're looking at. This is very ambitious and takes a certain level of confidence in engaging, people in it. But it's really interesting. You can sort of do it as a fly on the wall, just as sort of an observational. Again, what are people bringing into the space and what are they using? Shadowing, sort of like maybe a combination between a day in the life and a fly on the wall, but just tagging along with someone through their daily activities. So trying to see their everyday life and experiences, but also talking to them about it. So in a shadowing, you might observe and not intervene, but then you also might kind of ask them about it afterwards, like, so what was happening there, and doing a little bit of an interpretation. And the reason that the shadowing is really, I think, interesting is a lot of times users, when you're engaging in especially like a survey process, they might tell you, I want this. They might tell you, I want a red straw, or I want a really long straw, or whatever. And they're actually going to do something else. So when you watch them going through their everyday life, you might see something that makes what it is that they told you they want not really not seem to kind of line up or jive. And so it's a really important sort of comparative exercise between what it is that they might say they want and what it is that they might do that would prompt you in a different direction. So this is probably the least interesting of the photos that I have up or have in this presentation. But really, obviously, again, in this first assignment, when you guys are going out, if you have a friend, if you're doing a health and exercise, and you have a friend who does weightlifting, maybe you're going to go with your friend to their weightlifting class or to their weightlifting, whatever it is that they do, and watch them and see what happens and see what kind of community is around, or just see what they're doing, right? And take some notes and then talk to them about it. So in this first assignment, you're totally welcome to engage people that you already know for some of these observations. And then I think this is the last one I have on here. So network mapping is another one. So really observing the social connections and interactions that exist, and notate and map those. So again, you can observe that. So if we use a coffee shop example again, maybe you're going to see how many people are in groups versus how many people are are by themselves in the coffee shop. Maybe you're going to see how many people in those groups are talking and laughing and having fun versus how many are studying or doing some other kind of group activity. And you notate and map those. So Paul Butler, who was an intern at Facebook, did this really interesting map where he literally mapped all the Facebook connections around the world. And so these lights, so you can see, and I use this example later to kind of say in the lecture that I do on mapping to say, well, there's information that's missing from this map, right? But what you start to see is where there's tons of activity and tons of connections, and where there's sort of not, but I think there's some really, well, it's maybe not so surprising, but it also gives you some indications of like, that's pretty interesting that I think this is Brazil, right? That there's this area of Brazil that has a lot of connections to this area in Africa. Like, what's that all about, right? So it can be a really interesting prompt for kind of digging deeper and trying to understand what's driving those connections potentially. Oh, this one last thing. I think this one is actually could be a really good one for this first assignment, this activity analysis. So looking closely at one user or group of users and documenting in detail what it is that they're doing, going through an activity. So at the risk of being like overly redundant, back to the coffee shop, what exactly does somebody do the minute they walk in the door to not necessarily the minute they leave, but to the minute that they sit down, right? So what are all the steps? What is everything that they're doing? Are they getting their wallet out of their back pocket? Are they getting it out of a purse? Are they paying with a credit card? Are they there with another person? What is every single thing that that person is doing? And you do that over time, and you compare that among different users, and there becomes some really rich data that you can start to see there's patterns here or there's not. So something like cooking or making bread, for instance, you can start to see all the tools that are being used in this very moment. How long this child is, potentially kneading the bread for, right? How dirty is he getting? What's getting all over the counter or not? What tools is he using over here? What techniques is he doing to it looks like he's making like little bagels or something like that, but what techniques is he using? So recording every single stage of that. Or he's making pretzels, I guess, rolled up pretzels. And then you want to compare these, right? So we're going to ask you in this first assignment to use multiple methods. You're going to be going back to the place that you're observing, wherever you're observing, multiple times. So we want you to use potentially multiple methods. You don't have to. You can use the same method if there's a clear reason, like if you really want to compare something again and again. But they should always be compared and tested by asking, right? So I already kind of said this. So as a part of this assignment, you are going to be asked to interview casually for this one, a couple people to kind of compare against your findings. So let's talk about assignment one. And we've already kind of talked about it, but really specifically now. This assignment, the goal of it is for you to practice empathy in design research. So you're going to be observing a designed experience deeply and intently in order to identify a wicked problem. So this is really the output of this assignment. You're not designing anything. You're not solving the problem. You're identifying what the wicked problem might be. I would also look at this assignment as sort of like a pilot test. You're going to try a lot of different methods, part of your reflection at the end of this assignment, might be, these methods really worked well, these didn't, here's why, whatever. So don't think that it's going to be perfect. It's an opportunity to practice design research and explore new methods and skills. So that's why, we want you to try a couple different things. These lectures, the slides will all be online too, so if you don't get all this, you can go back to it. It's also an opportunity, you might not think about this right away, for you to record and reflect on the biases you might have. We all have biases, right? So if I'm deciding to observe a coffee shop, I'm going to have an assumption or a bias that I'm going to go in there and people are going to be buying coffee. That might not be true, right? They might all be buying tea, or they might all be buying bottled water or bubbly water. But my assumption is going to be that they're going to behave a certain way. If I think about Global Village, the coffee shop over on Hillsborough Street, my assumption is that I'm going to go in there, and people are going to be studying, and they're going to be drinking coffee, and there's not going to be a lot of talking. I mean, those are assumptions that I'm going to bring into this. And so this assignment is an opportunity for you to record those assumptions and then really compare what the assumptions and biases you had about the experience were either reinforced or dispelled by the observation itself. So steps: decide the locations that your group will be studying. These experiences that we put as a part of the assignment are quite broad, right? So we have a dining or food experience. You're going to need to get with your group more specific about that. Do we want to look at coffee shops? Do we want to look at at the cafeterias on campus? Do we want to look at one very specific dining hall, or do we want to look at a range of dining halls? So in your first meeting, you're going to want to get real specific with your group about what exactly it is that you're going to be observing. Define roles and responsibilities for the project. So one person is probably going to be the one that keeps everybody on track and makes sure that things are done when they say they're going to be done. Another person might be in charge of kind of compiling all of the data, and just kind of editing it. And another person might be the proofreader. So define what those roles and responsibilities are with your group. So who's going to be doing what? Everybody needs to observe. But these roles and responsibilities are sort of a little bit more geared towards putting everything together for the project. Make a plan for the observation. Do you want to do it all at the same time, or do you want to do it at different times? You all need to do it individually, but you could do it at the same time. But again, a part of this assignment is you doing the observations individually and then coming back together to compare the results. But you can all do them at the same time. You can say, look, let's take an hour or 2 hours or whatever, and let's go out and let's do this observation, then come back. You're going to spend at least a week observing your experience. So what that means is that you might say, OK, we're going to go out 2 or 3 times for an hour or 2 over the course of the week. And we're going to go to this specific location, and we're going to do it for an hour or whatever. Or you might say, and this again is really dependent on what it is that you're looking at, you might say, well, let's just spend the entire week kind of anecdotally recording things. So we're going to be a fly on the wall, but we're just going to look at it sort of generally over the course of the week. So again, it's going to depend on what your experience is, what you've decided that you want to observe, that kind of stuff. Discuss your findings as a group, and then develop your questions. So the result of those initial findings, after you've done this, you're going to develop questions. So what questions do we have about what it is that we saw, right? So we're in the coffee shop, and everybody's buying green tea. Maybe we want to ask some people. We just want to casually ask them, why are you buying green tea and not coffee? We notice a lot of people are buying green tea at the coffee shop, and that's kind of odd to us. So develop some of those questions that, again, you want to casually ask people. So it should not be formal. You can just, why are you buying green tea? Is it good? What's up with that? Definitely you want to say, I'm doing a very anecdotal, survey for a class, and I'm just curious, why are you? Casually interview these 2 to 3 people. That's what I mentioned. So the interview doesn't have to be, it can really be 1 or 2 questions. It can be sort of in passing. What you're trying to do is just compare what it is that people are saying with what it is that they are maybe doing. All of these sort of interviews, or just these casual interviews, are are just anonymous, so don't use anybody's name in anything or anything like that. Don't take their picture. It's just going to be kind of you're going to include it in your project anecdotally. So the deliverables for this assignment are the photo journal. This is a group. You're only going to create one of these. The 5 to 10 slide PDF, this is group. You're only going to create one of these. Only one person in your group needs to upload these first two things. So, and then you individually will upload your reflection and the peer review, which is a pretty straightforward peer review. So one group, if you're the leader, you will upload all 4 of those things. Everybody, or if you've been agreed to upload them all, everybody else will just upload these 2 things. So make sure, have very specific outlines on the assignment, but make sure that all your group members' names are on the title page so that your TA it will be easier for them to grade that. Your group is going to consist of 4 to 6 members. I already sort of mentioned this, so I won't just in the essence of time. This Friday forum, so this coming Friday, or actually the Friday forum for this week, which is actually going to be due on Sunday, is really getting through the first 3 things in this plan. So we're asking you to do all of this by Sunday, right? So it's really just making the plan so that, and that's going to be what will be part of the assignment, right, that you're going to be doing. So we're asking you to do that just so you're not leaving it until the last minute. So this Friday forum, we'll kind of ask you to do those things. Your TA should have sent you out a Google Doc, or your instructor should have sent you out a Google Doc for you to claim your experience. You have to do, if you haven't done it already, do it by 5 p.m. tonight. Your TA is going to go back through and make sure that there's enough people in each group. He or she might switch you around a little bit if they need to, but they're going to try to do it in a way that, like for instance, I was noticing that on one of them there were like 3 people in the alternative transportation, and there were like 2 people in the health and exercise experience. So we might collapse those, but you can find a way to connect those 2 things together. So if you're really interested in health and exercise, maybe you're going to look at pedestrian activity within that alternative transportation or something. And they'll email you, and if you really have a problem, then we can, they can work with you a little bit. As I mentioned, it's going to be due Sunday, August 28th, so you have the weekend to meet with your group if you need it. For the forum, each team member is going to it's going to be like a cut and paste. Each team member will post the exact same group outline of like the topic and the plan and the roles and responsibilities. So you'll have one central document that all of your team is working on, and then you'll just cut and paste those things into your forum post. You're also going to turn in an individual reflection, so this is going to be unique to you, about what that group meeting changed, about your sort of understanding of the experience or whatever. Just what it was like, what the team meeting was like, how it changed, possibly what you thought you were going to study or what you wanted to study or how you were going to go about studying it or observing it or whatever. So there's kind of 2 components. This is all outlined. Will all come out to you will be posted by the end of the day, so you're going to see real specific, like what it is that you need to do for the forum. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to do before we break is just introduce your TAs sort of to you virtually. Let me go back into, I should have this up. All of you should have gotten an email from your TA already, and I saw them go out, so I think that they all went out. I mentioned this in an email, I did have to switch around just like 1 or 2 people, just because there were some late additions. So if you have any problems today, what is going on? Sorry. Uploading. Okay, hold on. Yeah, it's not. Oops. This says TL12. Okay, what I can do is, okay, we got 1 minute. What I wanted to show you, yeah, I don't know why it's not. Yeah, I can do it. Hold on 1 second. Let me just. Of course, I put this away to make it cleaner up here, but. I wanted to show it to you on Moodle because let's see, because you can access this information on Moodle. So that's why I wanted to show it to you here. And then I might not be able to do it. Room controls. Okay, let's see if I can switch it over. Okay, thank you. Okay, now of course it's tiny. Is that good? So up under course information and resources, you have your TA groups and discussion section information. So we have broken, this is Dexter, we have broken up all of your groups are just alphabetical. So Dexter is at the beginning of the alphabet. It also has your discussion section. So who's going to be going to discussion section on Monday? These HDMI things always do that. I just flipped back over. Versus who's going to be going on Wednesday. So again, we've just further broken them down. So Dexter, Karen, it also has their email address, and it also has the discussion location. So this is a resource for like, who's your TA? What do you need to do for discussion? Back on the schedule, it says, just do, seriously? Okay. So back on here, if you haven't been looking over this, look over it. So because it has every week, it clearly says what we're going to be doing, what the lecture is going to be, all that kind of stuff. So next week, and I'm going to remind you about this again, but next week, the 29th and the 31st is your first discussion group. So just make sure that you've gone and looked at who your TA is, where your discussion. They're going to send out a reminder to remind you of this. So hopefully you'll be reminded. Are there any questions? It's time for us to go, but are there any questions that anybody wants to ask before we go? Okay, thanks again for coming to the 8:30 session, and especially today with our little snafus. Hopefully we'll get it all dialed in, but thank you. Thanks, April.